And then there was a series of legislative successes that included the Fair Bus School Law, scholarships for college students in 1964, auxiliary services to non-public schools, which I believe had 8 separate service areas like school crossing guards, school nurses, remedial reading, and then tuition grants to college students, which survives today. Has never been challenged and been extremely important to private colleges in the state of Michigan. And then eventually parochiate also passed. People forget that it passed the legislature and then subsequently voted down in a constitutional amendment.
Now we're up to 1970, but even before that, there were a lot of great things going on for the Michigan Catholic Conference during the 1960s. All lights were green, all systems were go. But there were a few rearguard actions that probably you were still fighting. For instance, the U.S. Supreme Court decision on banning school prayer, which to many people seemed to mean that maybe government shouldn't be giving state or federal financial assistance to non-public schools. How much of a challenge was that?
Well, not much, actually, because we took the position that we were asking the state to aid the secular aspects of education, the math, the science.
Or busing, or,
busing.
Transportation.
Right.
Yeah.
And also,
crossing guards.
Also, we were proposing that aid be given to the family, to the students, to the parents, not to the institution. Although that's a fine distinction, it's nevertheless an important legal distinction. So we didn't acknowledge many restraints philosophically and legally.
Well,
not that we were right, as it turned out.
Well, still the financial challenge to non-public schools was mounting. There were real problems everywhere, not just in Roman Catholic schools, but Christian Reform schools, any private, at the K-12 level. And so that led up to the big battle over what was called parochiate in 1969 and 70. And you're right, the legislature passed a bill or bills sanctioning or approving aid to non-public schools, signed by Governor Milliken, who supported it. But then a counter petition drive by the Michigan Education Association, the public school teachers, was mounted to get the question on the ballot to ban all. Let me just ask you one question. Why such acceptance of state aid to private colleges but not to non-public K-12 education?
Yeah, well, I think it's largely, Bill, because of the recognition that K-12, you were not an adult and therefore were impressionable and could not make, or likely would not make, independent decisions about your religious beliefs. Whereas college students, religion was an elective, not part of the curricula. So you could decide you weren't interested in taking the history of Christianity or whatever.
So do you think that was a valid distinction?
Yeah, I do.
But today, probably the language that exists today in the Constitution, because of the parochiate amendment in 1970, bans all aid to K-12 non-public schools other than the auxiliary services that you have described, which are still okay. But there's also been a push in recent years for vouchers. And that has gone nowhere with the Michigan public, when it's gotten on the ballot or in polls. What is, in your mind, is there a connection between the issue of aid to non-public students kind of backdoor through tax credits or vouchers to their parents on the one hand, as opposed to direct aid from the state to non-public schools 30 years ago, or not?
Well, I think there is, and I think the driving forces of both movements, our movement in the 70s and the current movement starting in perhaps the early 90s, is quite distinct. I think the so-called religious right, the Christian coalition, convinced the National Republican Party that this was an important issue. That wasn't our motivation. We were basically isolated to Christian Reform, Lutheran, and Catholics. This is a much broader, almost a political, philosophical question about, you know, against government monopoly of education.
Yeah. Whereas you were simply trying to save religious schools that had existed for decades, and they were embattled financially, and you were trying to prop them up and help them. This decade of the 1960s, a time of great ferment and controversy and achievement, there were some colorful legislators that you probably ran into from time to time, weren't there?
Yeah, and I'll get to that. And I just want to say the passage of that legislation that took 2 years.
This is parochiate again, 1969 and 70.
It passed with no extra votes. I mean, the Senate was right on the mark at 20, and I don't know whether the House had 56 or 57. It took 2 years to do it. And Bill Ryan, the Speaker of the House, was
a Democrat from Detroit.
He was singularly devoted to this issue, and he just gave his lifeblood to it almost. This was an achievement in terms of the degree of difficulty in passing something through a legislative door. There wasn't a half an inch to spare. And I think it reflects the fact that it was an issue ahead of its time, in the sense that it shouldn't have passed. I mean, it was just almost a miracle that it passed, and it reflects a division in society, and we were way ahead of the judicial time frame for this question. So,
well, it was a little surprising to a lot of people that Governor Milliken, a Republican who just taken office in '69 when George Romney left to go to Washington with the Nixon administration, came out in support of parochiate. Whereas before that, Romney had opposed parochiate for K-12 schools, and I don't think Milliken had ever had much, you know, of a record in support of it, but he came out for it and signed the bill.
We cultivated, my friend Stuart Hubble, who became the head of Citizens for Michigan, which was the armed forces, the ground troops of this effort to secure passage of parochiate, was a friend of Milliken's, and he introduced him to me when Bill came here to Lansing in 1960, right after his primary. I was one of the first ones to meet him in the drugstore of the Jack Tar Hotel, and we developed a relationship.
This is Bill Milliken.
Bill Milliken. And we became quite close. Philosophically, we were not very far apart, to the point when he ran for lieutenant governor in 1964.
At a convention, and then in the general election with George Romney.
In which Romney was supporting Allison Green, the then Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives. We clearly went out and did everything we could to help Bill Milliken become lieutenant governor.
You know, well, you made history because he narrowly beat Green in the convention, and then he was elected with Romney. And
then in 1970, while the parochiate question, Proposal C, was on the ballot, in 1970, we put people door to door in many, many counties in the state to remind the people of his commitment to the question of educational equality.
And he won by only 44,000 votes over Sander Levin.
I really think we were a substantial difference in that election for him. So there was a connection that was at that point 10 years old. And I really, you know, he had many personal characteristics similar to Phil Hart. When he was with you, he had great listening ability. And You could always predict on any given social question where he was going to come down. It was always on the side of the underdog.